there's a difference between a sermon and giving a faith story. You know, I'm used to sermons, 3 points and 20 minutes. If I can't say it in 20 minutes, I didn't work hard enough. A faith story is a little bit different. I don't promise you 3 points. I don't even promise you 20 minutes. But we'll try. A passage of Scripture that I think is a very important passage. It's from Matthew's Gospel. Remember, Matthew was the tax collector who went to follow Jesus. Now, when Jesus came into the district of Caesarea Philippi, he asked his disciples, "Who do men say that the Son of Man is?" And they said, "Some say John the Baptist, others say Elijah, others Jeremiah or one of the prophets." He said to them, "But who do you say that I am?" Simon Peter replied, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." And Jesus said to him, "Blessed are you, Simon Bar-Jonah, for flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, but my Father who is in heaven." Where does faith begin? At birth? I was born a white male in America. I had no choice over that. I could have been born in Asia. I could have been born in Africa. It's why prejudice doesn't make any sense to me. How can we be prejudiced against someone for something they didn't choose? It just was chosen for them. No, faith is different than birth. Faith is a choice. You can't inherit it. You can't be born into it. You have to be, would you believe, born again. That's, I think, what Jesus meant. You have to make a choice. You have to make a decision. You have to say yes to something like God. Like Simon Peter said, "You're the Christ." That's to be born again. That's the decision. That's the yes. I was lucky. I was born sixth in a family of six, the only one born in the hospital. The rest were all born at home with a wet nurse or whatever they called them. I was born into a family where I was loved and welcomed. I was born in the midst of the Depression, but I don't remember it being too disastrous for us. From the beginning, I knew that I was different than my siblings. I was always curious, intellectually asking questions. I was a student forever, as Nancy can attest. 26 years I was enrolled somewhere in some program. I have enough degrees to wallpaper the bathroom with. My faith journey grew alongside my educational journey. I always thought that for God to reach me, He had to do it through my mind. So all along through my life, I've been asking questions. What makes sense? Why are we born? Why are we here? Where did we come from? For what reason do we exist? Is there a creator, or are we just an accidental collision of molecules over billions of years?
Can we fix the sound system?
Can we fix the sound system? That's a question I can't answer. You can't hear it, in other words.
We want, yeah, it cut out. We want to hear what you're saying.
Don't want to be cut out.
Could you give us that list of questions again? We only got the first one.
Okay. I'm glad to see somebody else has problems with this electronic stuff. I'm a tech, no. I never know anything technically. Turn it off?
It's back on.
Sorry.
Okay, I was talking about questions. I was born asking questions. Where did we come from? For what reason were we born? What makes sense? What about creation? Are we the accidental collision of molecules put together over billions of years, or was there a creator? Something that caused us, a first cause, a being, a God. My dad was a preacher. He was a good preacher. He was a good dad, too. One of his common themes was about the stranger from Galilee. Over the years, that stranger became my friend, and then my Lord, and then my God. I said yes somewhere along the line. I was born again and again. From my father came an inclination toward faith, along with a love of the Red Sox, along with an appreciation for the power of the spoken word, how words could be used to hurt or to heal. Sometimes when I was younger, I can recall using my words to hurt. I was born into a family where there was no racial prejudice at all. I can remember when I was very young, a black gospel singer would come and spend weekends with us twice a year. And he would sing, and he could sing. And one year when I was 10, he said, "Shep, what do you want me to sing tomorrow?" I was 10 years old. I said, "Were you there?" 10 years old. Were you there when they crucified my Lord? Irrational. Doesn't make sense. But it was a precursor to other strange, irrational events in my faith story. For someone who always stressed reason and rationalism, I did some irrational things. I'll share a few with you. In high school, I was shy, cocky, always near the top of the class. One time I was standing in line to get tickets to a basketball game for the state tournament. I saw this girl up ahead of me in line. Turned to this friend and said, "Who is that? I know every good-looking junior and senior in this school." And it was a big school. He said, "Oh, that's Nancy McMillan." Irrational. I said, "I'm going to marry her." I'd never met her. I've done some irrational things. And it happened. It happened 5 years later, through a strange sequence of events. I tried to date her, but she wouldn't date me. Then I went off to college and I wrote to her to invite her to a party, but I sent it to the wrong town, so she never got it. And then after I'd finished with an MBA at Columbia, I'd broken up with a German girl who was a nurse, and my brother had gone to Florida that year before with some friends, and he said, "Boy, we stopped off at Rollins College. You remember that Nancy McMillan?" I said, "I certainly do." So I got on the phone. 1 year later, we were married. Strange, irrational things. In college, through scholarships and working, my father never had to contribute to my expenses. When I left, he gave me a check for $25 to cover incidentals. He appreciated that because it wasn't like the rest of my family, who he had gone broke to support. Two events I'd share that related to my faith. When I was a sophomore in college, I was elected president of the fraternity. That in itself was a little bit unusual as a sophomore. But that year, when we were taking in a pledge class, we decided to pledge one of the two black students that were in the college. Unbeknownst to us, there was the right of the alumni to send in a black ball. We got 4 or 5 black balls in the mail. They'd never met this man. They just knew he was black. I called a meeting of the fraternity brothers, and we spent a long time knowing the price we would pay would we would be kicked out of the national fraternity. We voted unanimously to pledge, Ed, and we did drop out of the national. But sometimes justice pays off. Not always. I call it divine earthly retribution. It's when God does on earth what he wants to do in heaven. 10 years later, Ed Beckham was the dean of Wesleyan University. The other event I'd share is, I don't remember many sermons, even my own. But Richard Niebuhr, who was the brother of Reinhold, was a professor at Yale Divinity School, and he came up to preach on our Wednesday evening chapel program. His sermon was, Lord, liar, or lunatic. No wandering prophet, no healer, no wonderful, compassionate teacher. Lord, liar, or lunatic. Once again, I was born again. He was Lord, not a liar, not a lunatic. I said yes, born again, and again, and again. Church has always been important to me. I worshiped even if I stayed out too late, maybe had a bit too much to drink. I went a few Sundays, the first year at Wesleyan, to the Methodist church, because that was my heritage. But he was pompous, and he was boring. So I ended up really for the 4 years mostly going to the Episcopal church. I loved the liturgy of the Episcopal church, the beauty of the language, the flow of the prayers. Economics was my chosen field in college. I graduated with distinction and with honors. I applied to business school at Harvard and Columbia. They wanted 2 examples of my best writing. I submitted a paper on the post-World War II monetary policy of the Federal Reserve System, and irrational. A paper, handwritten, because I never learned how to type, on the doctrine of the Trinity. Irrational to a college, to a graduate school of business administration. The dean at Columbia introduced me as the new Standard & Poor Fellow and said when we got this paper on the Trinity, we knew this guy was either nuts or something special. He was also very happy that I turned out Harvard in the process, not realizing that Columbia was willing to more than pay my way through, and Harvard wasn't. Again, I graduated from Columbia with money in the bank. Money has always been important to me in a certain way because my father was always in financial trouble. He never knew how to handle money. I didn't know it then, but I was abiding by John Wesley's principle, earn all you can. I never apologized for asking for a raise. Save all you can. Nancy and I saved no matter how little we made. Give all you can. And we did, such that the IRS several times said, prove it. My father grew up in a time when the prayer of most churches in New England was, God, send us a preacher humble and poor. You keep him humble, we'll keep him poor. I never bought into that philosophy. The draft was on then, so I enlisted in the Navy in their business branch, the Supply Corps. After OCS, which I hated because it covered all subjects that I knew nothing about, like navigation, gunnery, weapons. Then I went to supply school at Athens, Georgia, and here was the subject I knew a lot about. I had to be carefully how I did with all the tests, because if you landed in the first 10, you would chances get your choice of duty. But if you were 1, 2, or 3, you would get what then was considered the best duty for any career naval officer in the Supply Corps. And that was independent duty on a destroyer, 6 months at sea. No, that wasn't my first choice. My first choice was Hawaii. Nancy's first choice was Japan. She got her first choice. She often did. Her choices were often better than mine. For 3 years, as a financial officer at a large Navy base in Japan, we lived there, and we learned to love that land. For my family and for others, it was all really the homeland of the enemy. My father and all my brothers had served in the Second World War. We saw the other side of the Japanese people. We saw they were much like us. 2 things I would share. Nancy and I were both active in the chapel. That was where I preached my first sermon. Nancy played the piano and learned how to play the organ there. One time, there was a command performance cocktail party, which meant the supply department would throw a party for all the officers on the base, and we would chip in, and we would have to be there. At the meeting discussing this, I told the commander, I'm troubled, I have a commitment that night, and I don't think I should break it. He said, you be there. I didn't go. The next day he called me into his office. He was quite angry and upset. He said, you disobeyed my orders. I said, I'm sorry, but I made a commitment. I was teaching a class at the chapel, made up of both Japanese and Americans. I didn't feel comfortable to back out from it. Well, he hemmed and hawed. The next day he called me into the office again. He literally crossed his desk, threw my fitness report at me. It was the best fitness report I ever received. He said, I didn't agree with you, Shep, but I respected you and appreciated you. The other thing that always would get me in trouble in the military, as an officer, you weren't supposed to mingle with and mix with enlisted. Well, I could never abide by that. So Nancy and I often secretly had some of the enlisted people who worked for me to our home for dinner. I began asking myself in Japan, what comes next? What do I want to do? I knew then that I didn't want to go back to Wall Street, to go back with the insurance company that offered me a good job. I didn't want to spend my life helping others make a lot of money, even if I made a lot along the way. I knew there was something more, something deeper, something better. So I applied to Cornell University for a PhD in economics, thinking I would teach, maybe some way combine my faith and my training in finance and business. I was accepted at Cornell with a great fellowship, again, to pay all of our way. But at the same time, Nancy was pregnant with our third. Nancy was always pregnant. We had 3 kids in 2.5 years. I don't know how or why. So I extended in the Navy for a year to come back. We hadn't seen our parents for 3 years. Coming back to Boston, being the supply officer at the old Fargo building in downtown Boston, I wondered what it would be like. Would it be like Japan? We lived so wonderfully there. Living as a junior officer in Japan, we lived like royalty. Coming home to Boston as a junior officer, we were at the poverty level. I was in charge of the mess hall and the brig and a few other things. I had to be on duty about every 4 days. So I took 2 courses at Boston University, one in the history of philosophy and one in the philosophy of religion, one taught by a young Quaker scholar who was a brilliant man. One night I came home and sitting around the dinner table, I said to Nancy, I think I'm going to seminary next year. Now that's not your average conversation around the table. She hadn't married into this. I could imagine what someone else might say. What are you talking about? I didn't bargain for that. What did she say? I'm not surprised. The best choice I ever made in my life was to marry Nancy. With 3 kids, we needed a place to live. There were student churches. They were a place that would supply a parsonage and enough money perhaps to buy groceries and a few other things. We were appointed to Byfield, a little town near Newburyport, Mass. 60 members, smallest church in our conference. Here began a love affair with the local church. Here I had my first funeral. I had never attended a funeral until I had to conduct one. Here I began the process of preparing weekly sermons and reveled in it. Byfield was a wonderful experience for me. We had intended to stay there for 3 years, but a chance came up to move much closer to Boston, to double the pay, and so I took that opportunity. They were disappointed in Byfield. They were angry. They held a going away party for Nancy. At seminary, I came under the influence of some great scholars. Harold Beck, who was the professor of Old Testament and a great preacher, and Dean Walter Mueller, one of the brilliant minds of the ecumenical scene. The Dean, Walter Mueller, was a pacifist and almost a socialist. I was a young naval officer and a capitalist. Talk about an odd couple, a strange duo. I went on under his mentorship to get a PhD, originally again thinking I would teach. But in the process of moving through seminary and the PhD, I moved to some of the most important churches in my life. One was a church in Sudbury, Massachusetts. After 14 years there, 14 wonderful years, I faced the bishop one day and said, you know, I'm ready for something new, something different. He said, oh, Shep, I've got just the place for you. It was the largest Methodist church in New England. It was in Connecticut, but it was badly divided. The minister who I followed had split the church right down the middle. The first year there, I was in serious depression, wondering what I had done leaving a church where I was loved and where I loved. One time I shared with Nancy that, you know, this church is like a wounded elephant. It's like an elephant on its knees. It needs serious help. What can I do? I shared that story with no one except Nancy. Stewardship and finance was always one of my strengths. The first year after there, even in the midst of my depression, the treasurer, who became a good friend, would always call on January 1st after he balanced the books. Said, Shep, we're down about 15 or 20,000. Each year he called after that. The second year we were breaking even. The third year he was very excited. We were about 40 or 50,000 up. Each year it got better and better, and he got happier and happier. But the church was a killer. It was a tough one. 50 funerals, 60 weddings. It was a Gothic-style cathedral, not common for the Methodist church, but a beautiful sanctuary. I loved preaching in that sanctuary. A choir with about 60 or 65 singers, and the best church musician I've ever dealt with. That part was wonderful. But the 70-hour weeks began to take their toll. Again, I talked to the bishop, and I always had a wonderful relationship with my bishops. I said, Bishop, before I retire, I'd like a small church, a small staff, not 15 or so that I had. Just give me a secretary and a part-time sexton, and I'll be happy. Okay, so we moved to Weston, Massachusetts, a lovely little town. But as we were leaving, the church threw a party. This one I was invited to. And each of the departments or the committees gave us a present. The mission store that Nancy and I had actually started, which would buy things from artists in Africa through a program called Serve and sell them, and all the money would go back to the artist. The little group had done very well. People bought things and supported it. When we came to the gift from the mission store, it was in a huge box, about almost as big as this. And we unwrapped it, and it was a carved wooden elephant. Talk about God speaking to you directly. God saying, yes, the elephant is up off its knees. Maybe you had something to do with that, Shep. That was as direct as God has ever spoken to me. Here's the elephant. Enjoy it. We moved to Weston, which was a very affluent community just this side of Boston. It's where the local entrepreneur, Jeff Vinnick, came from. He had a multi-million-dollar home there. The Methodist Church, as usual, was on the other side of the tracks. So whatever non-wealth there was in the town, they came to our church. But it was a wonderful church. 45 hours a week, and they thought I was great, and I thought I was semi-retired. It was in Weston I was diagnosed with cancer. And the support of the church, and whether you're a minister or not, if you have a church family to support you, it makes all the difference in the world. A group of the younger women in the church said, okay, we'll each of us in our own way, at 8 o'clock in the morning, we'll pray for Shep. One woman told me the story. She was bombing along, trying to get her young son to school on time. And he said, Mom, pull over. She said, why? We have to stop and pray for Dr. Johnson. The support of the church in times like that makes all the difference in the world. We moved then on retirement to a lovely little cottage on an island outside of Portland, Maine. And here Nancy was diagnosed with cancer. And again, the support of the local church, and actually the support of most of the people on the island. She had to drive down to the ferry for 10 days in a row to get radiation treatment. And the last day that she had the treatment, everyone on the ferry knew it. And when she got on the ferry, they all cheered. That kind of support. Then we moved here to the shores. And again, the support of the congregation, because here was the most painful thing that ever happened to us, the death of our son, our youngest son. Jan came almost every day for a week or more. Michael Shaw, the executive director, appeared at our door with a week full of groceries from Massaro's, our favorite market. The head chef came up with a leg of lamb, knowing that it was my favorite meat. The support of people in the church. When I was diagnosed just a few years ago with Parkinson's disease, at least 2 people here said, Shep, you shouldn't go to the doctor you're going to. You've got to go to Dr. Pappas. She's the best thing around. When I finally did switch doctors and go to Dr. Pappas, she said, well, I'm glad you're finally here. I'm sick of these calls from the people over there saying you've got So the journey goes on. That stranger of Galilee has been with me all the way. As the hymn we'll sing says, what more can he say, Shep, than to you he has said, to you who for refuge to Jesus hath fled. Thanks be to God.